Yes.
In that case, just remind them to use this mic.
Okay.
You know, that's
Yeah.
I will stop walking.
And I'll make sure people can hear me when I start.
Yeah, and also they can also use this mic.
Okay.
Just switch it.
Excellent. Thank you. Yes, Paris worded. Do you want to see it right? Would you like to see it? Of course, please. Yes, that's right. Oh, no, We're right on time. Welcome, everyone. Can people up the back hear me okay? Got a thumbs up. Thanks so much for that. Welcome, everyone. What a great room of people. Tonight we're having the Menzies Institute for Medical Research update here in Launceston, and it was lovely chatting to people earlier. We've got a few return people who came to our research update last year. So thank you for coming along. My name's Tracy Dixon. I'm the director at Menzies. So before we start our formal program, I'd like to acknowledge that today we're meeting on Lutruwita, Tasmania, and that these are Aboriginal land, sea and waterways. And I acknowledge with deep respect the traditional owners of this land, the Muwinina people, and the ongoing custodians, the Palawa Pakana people. Our island home is deeply unique, with spectacular landscapes and with our cities and towns surrounded by bushland, wilderness, mountain ranges and beaches. And I acknowledge that it's a privilege to stand on country and walk in the footsteps of those who came before us. And I stand for a future that profoundly respects and acknowledges Aboriginal perspectives, culture, language and history. So as I said, it's great to see so many of you here today. Some people are long-term supporters and donors to Menzies. Some are our northern collaborators and colleagues from across the health sector and the university. And there are also some people that are new to Menzies and perhaps are hearing about our work for the first time. So welcome to everyone. I'd also like to acknowledge the people in the room who have lived experience of the conditions that we're going to be talking about tonight. Thank you for being with us. At Menzies, our mission is to perform internationally significant medical research leading to healthier, longer and better lives for all Tasmanians. We have over 160 research staff and we're building the medical research workforce of the future with more than 80 PhD students. We work across key areas that affect our community, including cancer and genomics, prevention, health services and wellbeing, environmental and respiratory health, cardiovascular health and brain health. Our work is truly bench to bedside, with some researchers specialising in public health and epidemiology, others in clinical research, and others again in laboratory-based research. Although our buildings are physically located in Hobart, our work is explicitly designed to have impact across the whole state, nationally and internationally. So with Tasmania having a rapidly ageing population and statistically a very high prevalence of diseases where age is a risk factor, we're focusing our research at Menzies where it can have most impact. Every one of us in this room knows someone whose life has been adversely affected by a neurodegenerative disease, be it dementia, Parkinson's, or motor neuron disease, or a cardiovascular disorder, be that stroke, hypertension, or diabetes. Our work to better understand these conditions is vital in the global efforts towards improved treatments, better quality of life, and one day a cure. So tonight you're going to hear from three of our different researchers. The evening will be structured so that they will each give their presentations and then I'll invite them back up to the stage and we'll take any questions that we have as a panel. So there won't be a test. Everybody can relax. You can take notes if you would like to, but just please enjoy the evening. Our first researcher I'd like to introduce you to is Professor Shauna Gall. Shauna is a cardiovascular epidemiologist and her research is dedicated to understanding and preventing cardiovascular diseases such as heart attacks and strokes, with a particular emphasis on regional and remote communities. So please join me in welcoming Shauna.
Thanks, Tracy, and I will confirm that everyone can hear me as well. Yep, all right, great. So I'm going to be talking to you today about the research that me and my team have been doing about improving the prevention of stroke. And this is very timely because it is actually Stroke Week this week. So the Stroke Foundation, which is the national advocacy group for stroke, is running a number of events. So I was really pleased to have that coincide with today's event. Tracy has already done an acknowledgement of country, but I would like to draw on the fact that some of the research I'm talking about, one project in particular, has involved a lot of co-design and really talking to communities. And I think that what we're doing there is we're really drawing on a long history of the way that the First Nations people of Australia used yarning to really understand problems and work at those from a community level. And I would also like to acknowledge lived experience. And so as part of the cardiovascular research flagship at the Menzies, we do have a lived experience advisory group, or league as we call it, and they're very much involved in setting the priorities for the research that we conduct and certainly have been involved in the studies that I'll describe today. So stroke is a type of cardiovascular disease and it has two main types. The first type on the left here is where there's a blockage in the brain, and this is called ischemic stroke. And that's caused by the blood vessel blocking off in the brain, sometimes because a blood clot has travelled from somewhere else in the body and gotten lodged in the blood vessel, but it can also be from narrowing within the artery itself. That's the most common type of stroke, and it's responsible for around 80% of the strokes that happen in Australia. The other types of strokes that happen are those where there's bleeding into the brain, and these are called hemorrhagic strokes, and they have two main types. So these account for around about 20% of all strokes. There's a subarachnoid hemorrhage, and that's where the blood leaks into the outer layer of the brain from an aneurysm that ruptures. And then there's also what's called intracerebral hemorrhage, and that's where a blood vessel inside the brain bleeds into the brain tissue. Stroke is very common. So there are around 45,000 strokes that happen in Australia each year, and there's around about 1,500 that happen in Tasmania each year. And it's very costly to the Australian economy, estimated at around $9 billion per year. And that's related to healthcare costs, but also related to the ongoing care and support that people that have a stroke may need going forward. So what happens when a person has a stroke? As you can imagine, I showed that the blood supply to the brain gets affected. And when the brain cells, the neurons and the other cells in the brain don't receive blood, they begin to die. And as you can imagine, the brain controls everything that we do. So depending on where the stroke has happened, the effects of the stroke may show up in different ways. So there can be physical effects. So people may have problems moving their arms and legs. They may have difficulty speaking, seeing, hearing, understanding, and also things like swallowing and eating can be affected. But there are also a range of different cognitive, mental, and emotional effects. And so, because it's occurred within the brain, there may be difficulties with different cognitive tasks. But we also know that a number of people suffer from emotional effects such as depression and anxiety. And probably one of the leading things that people that have had a stroke talk about is the fatigue that happens. And this is an ongoing problem and affects quality of life and often stops people from doing the things they'd like to do and things like returning to work. So hopefully everyone in this room has seen the FAST sign before and heard this acronym, but because it's Stroke Week, I'm definitely going to talk about it again. So the FAST stands for the signs of stroke, and these are the most common sort of acute signs that you will see if someone is having a stroke. And so the different parts of the acronym stand for face. So is a person's face drooped down on one side? Arms are about if the person can't hold both their arms up straight. Speech may come out slurred or confused or words that don't make sense in a sentence. And the T stands for time. And it's really that time is very critical. The treatments that people can receive in hospital are more effective if the person gets them very soon after they've had a stroke. So within the sort of first 4 to 5 hours is when they're most effective. So the most important thing that anyone can do if they see any of these symptoms or think someone's having a stroke is to call an ambulance and particularly mention that you think the person is having a stroke because that will activate a higher level of response from an ambulance. One of the fortunate things about stroke is that it's estimated that around 80% of strokes are related to 10 quite common cardiovascular disease risk factors. So these are a number of behavioural risk factors that we might think of, like smoking, low physical activity, alcohol consumption, and diet, but also some aspects of stress that people experience as well. It's also related to a number of what we call biomedical risk factors. So things like diabetes, atrial fibrillation or a heart flutter, high blood pressure is the number one risk factor, and also cholesterol and obesity. The unfortunate thing is that these risk factors are also very common in our community. So this graph shows the proportion of people in the Australian population, and these are from various national health surveys, with a number of these different risk factors. And you can see that for some of them, like poor diet, and that's the proportion of people that don't meet the fruit and vegetable guidelines, so almost everybody. And then other things like physical inactivity and high blood pressure are also very prevalent. And so I guess what this means is because we know these risk factors and we know what we should be targeting, that there should be opportunities for better prevention. And one of the things that we've been looking at is the opportunities for mHealth or digital health approaches to preventing stroke. And as I've talked about, obviously people understanding their risk factors and knowing what to do is a real priority for people. And as I've said, we know there's a lot of stroke risk factors in the community. And it's been thought for several years that we might be able to use smartphones, which almost everybody has, very high usage within the community. And we know they have a lot of functions that could be used to deliver health interventions. Oh, here we go. Here's my little point. 60% of the global population own a smartphone. So these things are out in the community and could be leveraged. So we've been working with colleagues at the Auckland University of Technology that have developed a mobile phone app, which is called the Stroke Riskometer. And this particular app, it has an algorithm in it where people put in information about themselves, and it then tells them about what their likely risk of stroke is within a 5 to 10 year period. It gives a number of self-management strategies. It tells them about stroke risk factors and the signs and symptoms. And it has some built-in reminders to tell people about things they may have said they wanted to do, like increase their activity or take their medications. And there had been a pilot study done in New Zealand which suggests there was some improvement in stroke risk factors in people who were using this app. There is a QR code there. You can download this app. You can also search online for Stroke Riskometer. It's free, so you can find it and download it. We were funded through the National Health and Medical Research Council to do a randomised control trial to see whether using this app might help improve people's risk factors. And we recruited around 850 people into the study. And this is one of the examples, as Tracy said, this was conducted in lots of places around Australia. And because it's an app, it will be applicable across regional and remote areas as well. We were interested in whether it was changing people's risk factors, so those things that I talked about before that are known to increase the risk of stroke. And this was designed for people that hadn't suffered from a stroke or a heart attack before. This graph here, I'll talk you through it a little bit more. It's a little bit technical, but basically we're looking at here the differences between the people who did and did not receive the app. And if the dot is above the dotted line, that would suggest that the people that had the app had an improvement in their risk factors. And you can see that overall it was quite a small effect. So they had a little bit of an improvement in their risk factors at 6 months, but not a very large improvement over time. When we've looked into the reasons for this, so we ran this as a real world trial. So we basically told people about the app, we sent them information via email, we gave them instructions on how to use the app. But we know that at the end of the trial, about 20% of people actually never downloaded or used the app. And I think that's probably reflective of how people, behave out in the real world. We do know that people that used the app had a significant improvement in their knowledge and understanding of stroke. So that's an important outcome that we've seen as well. And we think that this does build on some of the evidence we have for these kind of M-Health interventions. And it does seem that they're a bit more effective in people who've already had something like a heart attack or a stroke, and that might be because of differences in their motivation and engagement. So the other study that I was going to tell you a little bit about is one that we're still currently recruiting from, but only for about 2 weeks. So I'll tell you a little bit more and you may be able to get involved if you're interested. But this was very much, again, focused on improving people's understanding of stroke risk factors and warning signs, and done in partnership with the Stroke Foundation, who run a community talk program called Stroke Safe, and some of you may be familiar with that. And this was built off the fact that about 40% of people in Australia can't name any signs of stroke. And this graph here shows that, I don't know if this works, that the line shows people's knowledge, and the dark black line shows that it goes up, and then over time it drops down after people attend one of these Stroke Safe presentations. Anyone who knows the University of Tasmania knows we love a massive online open course. And so these are large free courses available online, and they've certainly shown through the university to be a great way of engaging people in learning and understanding about a range of health conditions. So we received funding from the Medical Research Future Fund for a program that was called Love Your Brain, and this involved 2 components. One of them was the development of a MOOC, a massive online open course in stroke prevention, and the other part, which was done here at the University of Tasmania, and the other component was done through Monash University, which is a text messaging system which has similar messages to the Stroke Safe talk, but delivered via text messages. And what we did within this study is we spent a long time co-designing what both of these components of the intervention looked like. So this involved 12 focus groups that we ran over about a 6-month period. And this was with people within the community, but also health experts. And this helped us to figure out what we should put in this digital platform, so the MOOC and also the text messages, what type of information people wanted, how they wanted the information to look. So we spent a long time in the kind of design phase of this. And what we ended up with then was what we've called the Preventing Stroke MOOC. And this is a bit of a diagram of what the massive online open course looks like. It takes people right from understanding what a stroke is at the end through to specific action modules around those risk factors that I talked about before, helping people to understand how to quit smoking, helping people to improve their diet and so on. It's very interactive. And the other thing that people told us when we were developing it is that to increase motivation, we should have real people telling their stories. So we feature up to 70 videos, and a lot of those are from around a dozen people that have had a stroke, talking about their experience, talking about risk factor changes, and so on. So like the other study, we are testing this at the moment in a randomised control trial. And so in this study, people come into the study and then they're put into 3 different arms. Some people will get the massive online open course. Some people will get the text messages, and some people will be in a control group that receive information by email. And as I said, this study is still currently running. So if you're interested in learning more about stroke, there is the possibility to enroll, and you can search for Love Your Brain through the Stroke Foundation to find out more information about that. So just in closing, I would just like to reiterate that stroke is very common, and that I've shown you today about the signs. Hopefully everyone knows the signs of stroke, but certainly share them with other people so that we can increase that public knowledge. And I think it's important to understand that because stroke is affecting the brain, the effects on the person that has a stroke can be wide and varied. But fortunately, as I've said, we know that stroke is preventable. And so people understanding their risk factors, knowing what their risk factor levels are, particularly things like blood pressure, are very important. And it's really the message that everyone can do something to lower their risk of stroke. And the work that my team and I have been doing have been looking at digital tools that might prevent stroke and really building the evidence in that area. But I would also like to acknowledge that that's not going to be the only solution, and it's just really one piece of the puzzle. And we're doing a range of other activities and programs to look at how we can improve stroke prevention in other ways that are not just digitally focused, but looking at other community-based tools as well. So I'd like to finish just by acknowledging all the participants that have been in the various studies, certainly the staff and students that have been involved in managing and undertaking the research, and the various funding bodies, particularly the National Health and Medical Research Council, the Medical Research Future Fund, and the Heart Foundation as well. So thank you, everyone.
Now I'm going to ask everyone to stretch their brains and remember your questions for Shauna, and we'll move on to our next presenter. So I'd now like to welcome our second presenter for this evening, Professor Michelle Kalasaya. Michelle leads a program of work aimed at understanding and improving treatments for falls, frailty, and neurological disorders such as stroke, dementia, and Parkinson's disease. Michelle is also a registered physiotherapist with extensive clinical experience in the areas of neurological rehabilitation and aged care. Welcome, Michelle.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. So yes, I am a physiotherapist. I worked for many, many years at the Royal Hobart Hospital on the rehabilitation ward, mainly actually seeing people with stroke, traumatic brain injury, and I really loved working as a team and getting people up and moving again. But today I'm going to talk about improving access to rehabilitation for people with progressive neurological conditions. So I'll just start by saying, what is a progressive neurological condition? Well, neurological means of the nervous system, so that's the brain, the spinal cord, or the nerves that go out to the muscles and back, again, giving information to the brain. Conditions that affect that are progressive means that they do get worse over time. And the most common ones are Alzheimer's disease, a form of dementia, followed by Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, Huntington's, and ALS. And my work really focuses on those top two, dementia and Parkinson's. So dementia is really an umbrella term for many different types of dementia that you can see there. I can do the pointer. Oh, mouse. Okay. Great. So there. But what people often think of as with dementia is it really affects memory, but it does affect a lot more than just memory. It affects attention, it can affect the ability to plan the day, it can affect judgment, but it can also affect mood, motivation, and what I've been really interested in is it can affect people's physical function as well. And that's not just at the later stage, it can actually affect mobility really quite early on. You can see there it affects a large number of Australians. It affects people of working age, under 65, around 29,000 Australians. 11,000 Tasmanians have dementia, and most of those are actually living in the community with support. And then there's Parkinson's. So Parkinson's is also an umbrella term for a number of different conditions, and you can see there Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's disease is the most common form of Parkinson's. And what it affects is the dopamine producing neurons in the brain. And that lack of dopamine as those neurons die causes movement symptoms. So you can see up the top there of that iceberg, sorry, there, I'm pointing up there, slowness of movement. It affects the rigidity of the muscles. Some people have a tremor and it can affect posture and balance and gait. But what people don't realise, it can also affect a lot of other things that are unseen. And you can see that in the conditions that I've listed there below the iceberg. And that's things like cognitive function, although it's not necessarily memory, it's more attention and planning. It can affect things like smell, constipation, anxiety, motivation, and mood. You can also see that it affects a large number of Australians, 40,000 of working age, and around about 4,000 Tasmanians. And it's the fastest growing neurological condition in the world. And both these conditions are major causes of disability. They affect people's well-being and their quality of life. And particularly those things that are important to people. So it can affect hanging out with friends, it can affect work, hobbies, and it can also affect ability to stay at home. But there are a number of treatments. And so for dementia, there are some medications that can be there for the symptoms, although they're not fully effective. And really interestingly, there's been recently a new drug for dementia that actually impacts on the actual disease itself, amyloid, although it's very specific to early dementia and also specific types, and there are some significant risk factors with it. With Parkinson's, there are some fantastic medications again that will treat the symptoms, but for both conditions, there's no cure. And what happens with these medications is as the condition progresses, then these medications are unable to control the symptoms fully. And so there are some other different devices that some people are eligible. One of them is deep brain stimulation. And then there are also others like pumps. And then there's actually a new one on the PBS that's just been approved for Parkinson's that actually is an injection that goes into the skin and so bypasses the stomach. And so gets past some of those problems that the stomach has an effect on the absorption of the medications. But what happens is that the medications don't address all the symptoms. And so people still have some problems with some of the things that are important to them. And so if you had a stroke, if you think about it, you would have rehabilitation from a multidisciplinary team, and that would address the symptoms and the impairments that you have, and then would provide strategies to compensate for some of those things. Well, that's actually what is now recommended for people with both dementia and Parkinson's. Sometimes it's called reablement, but the World Health Organization is actually calling it rehabilitation, and it addresses, it tries to optimize function and reduce disability in individuals with health conditions, including dementia and Parkinson's. So what might that look like? Well, physiotherapists deliver exercise, and we know that exercise is really important for maintaining people's mobility and reducing falls. But exercise actually has a really important effect on the brain. So aerobic exercise, that huff and puff that we all love doing, improves blood flow to the brain and actually improves the chemicals that nourish the brain as well. In Parkinson's, the voice can get quite soft, and so speech pathologists are really important in giving exercises to increase the loudness of voice. That can help with other things in dementia, with communication, as well as in Parkinson's. And what probably people don't realise is also something called cognitive rehabilitation. We often think of going to the gym as the only type of rehabilitation, but occupational therapists are really good at this. They look at what is important to the person. So let's say that it's cooking, and then they'll say, okay, well, let's break the task down into simpler components. Let's practice those tasks. Or they might provide aids such as different coloured plates if someone's having problems with vision. They might provide timers or stoves that cut off so that if someone forgets to turn off the stove, or they might put pictures so that people remember where things are. So it's really to support people to continue to do the things that they want to do. And there's really good evidence for many of these interventions. I was involved in writing this book on dementia rehabilitation. It's a whole book on what you can do to support people to maintain activities at home. There's also good evidence in Parkinson's for a multidisciplinary team, particularly with allied health professionals in helping people to maintain what they want to do. But is this happening? And so one of the first studies that I want to talk to you about that I've been involved in and leading, and it's been funded by the Medical Research Future Fund, is about dementia and really trying to improve access to allied health. And I just want to give you an example of meeting Brian and Pat. So both Brian and Pat are 74 years old and they both retired 4 years ago. Brian experienced a major stroke 6 weeks ago, but Pat was diagnosed with dementia 6 weeks ago. Both have difficulties with word finding and understanding instructions. Both need a stick to walk, and both have difficulty with food preparation, and both can't do the things that are important to them, like cooking, quiz, and croquet. If you think of the care that someone with a stroke would get, they would get a multidisciplinary team and they would get rehabilitation. For someone with dementia, it's quite different. Even though they have those same impairments, they might get some medications, they might have their driver's license looked at, all really important, but they often have things put in place rather than helping them to continue the things that are really important to them. And so for Pat, that was cooking. And so she could have had occupational therapy to keep her cooking, but if she didn't, that could lead to loss in function, depression, and poorer quality of life. So we've done some work about on this and really looking at what allied health professionals' attitudes and beliefs, knowledge and confidence are in working with people living with dementia. And unfortunately, there are health professionals that think that people with dementia can't engage and can't improve despite the evidence. And there's really quite low knowledge and confidence. So if you ask a health professional how confident they are in working with someone with dementia, they often have quite low confidence. And it's probably not surprising because when we surveyed across Australia, there was only 4 hours of dementia education in a 4-year physiotherapy course, and it was mainly lectures. So it's not surprising. So our project really set out to go, well, what can we do about this? So we worked with a group of people living with dementia and their care partners, as well as a group of health professionals, including geriatricians, neurologists, allied health professionals, general practitioners. And these are just some of the quotes. So a care partner says, my husband didn't want to see the doctor. He was fearful of being labelled. So people don't want to get a diagnosis, and that can lead to quite a late diagnosis when it's harder to implement some of these strategies. A person with dementia said, I needed to know what I can do to make my life better. I was never able to find someone to help me, even though I was trying. And so there's not a lot of help out there sometimes, or it's hard to find. And then one of the health professionals said a lack of knowledge was seen as the basis of all problems and the key problem, leading to stigma, disempowerment, and lack of availability of services. So there was a lack of availability of people out there who were knowledgeable in dementia to deliver some of these interventions. So we did a couple of things. We worked with Dementia Australia, the organisation that supports people with dementia, and put some more information about allied health into the book that they give people at the time of diagnosis. We worked with an organisation that trains general practitioners in dementia to teach them more about what allied health professionals can do. And we also developed this course on dementia rehabilitation for allied health professionals. We tried to use a human rights-based approach that rehabilitation or reablement is a human right. We made sure that all allied health professionals did the course together so that they came from the same background and they learnt about each other and what they could do. We involved people with dementia in the teaching of the course. So there were videos with people with dementia talking about their experiences with allied health. We also provided real-life examples of how these services have been implemented in health services, and that includes down in Hobart. They run a fantastic program of occupational therapy for people with dementia in their home. And we provided examples to the people that did the course about what they could go and do in their workplace. And we also supported them over a period of 6 months through a community of practice. So did it work? So across Australia, we had over 500 people enrol from every state and territory of Australia. And the completion rate was almost 80%, which is excellent for some of these online courses. The health professionals said it really changed their mindset and their unconscious rigidity about working with people with dementia. And it led to simple changes that they could make, even despite them being quite junior. We did pre and post surveys, and it improved their knowledge on dementia, their confidence, and also their attitudes to working with people living with dementia. And really importantly, in their workplace, particularly when there was a group of allied health professionals that had done the course in the same workplace, they went and delivered multidisciplinary education. They set up dementia programs in their workplace. They changed eligibility criteria when people with dementia had been excluded. And they made sure that the referrers knew about their service. So it improved the number of referrals to their service. So this was really exciting, but I feel like there's still a lot to do. And so one of the things that we're working on now is trying to get some of this training into the undergraduate courses here at the University of Tasmania, and working with Jade Cartwright, who's a speech pathologist and lecturer here up in Launceston, to get that information into the courses. So I'm going to move on now for the second part of my talk for Parkinson's. And so while I was working on trying to improve access to allied health for people with dementia, I was diagnosed myself with Parkinson's about 3.5 years ago. And it was really hard. I was surprised how hard it was to find information and to find allied health professionals that had any expertise in that area. And so I was quite interested in whether this was an experience of other people who had been diagnosed. And this is a really interesting paper that has just come out this year, and it's a survey of over 300 people with Parkinson's in Australia. And what they've told us is that they feel that treatment is medically focused, the medical part is done well, but they don't get enough information and support at that time of diagnosis, particularly from a multidisciplinary team. And if you look at this bit here, these numbers here add up to less than 25%. So less than 25% of people found or agreed that they got enough support at the time of diagnosis. And again, only less than 25% were referred to allied health professionals. And then there was another paper that came out this year that looked at it from the side of the health professionals and the doctors, and they weren't sure who to refer to. They couldn't find these allied health professionals with expertise in Parkinson's. And so I started looking in the literature about what was available, and there was this fantastic model of care that was from the Netherlands called Parkinson Net. And back in 2004, they were kind of in this same situation. People with Parkinson's were dissatisfied with the care, the treatment was medically focused, it was difficult finding an allied health professional with expertise, and there were no guidelines. And so they set up what's called Parkinson Net. So it's been going now since 2004, and it's rolled now into a number of different countries in Europe. And really what it does is it empowers health professionals, patients, and teams, and really ensures that there's equitable care no matter where you live. So how does it do it? It trains health professionals to Parkinson's guidelines. It gives people with Parkinson's the same guidelines as the health professionals get, so that they know what they should be receiving, although it's in simpler language. It educates and trains the health professionals together so that they form networks of care, so that they work together and learn what each other does. And then there's a web finder portal on the internet, so that all these health professionals are really easily found. So if you are diagnosed with Parkinson's, you can look up the nearest therapist near you. So does it work? And so there's been a lot of research in the Netherlands looking at this model of care, and it has reduced hospitalisations, it's reduced hip fractures, it's reduced incidence of pneumonia, and really importantly, it's also reduced healthcare costs, and health professionals have better work satisfaction because they're able to work together in a team. So could we bring this to Australia? Well, look at the size of the Netherlands compared to the size of Australia. In the Netherlands, you're never more than 10 kilometres from one of these expert allied health professionals trained in Parkinson's. Do you think that could happen here? So we've got a bit of a challenge on our hands, and we also have quite a different healthcare system. Over there's a national insurance that basically covers almost everything. So really excitingly, the Commonwealth Government has funded us at the University of Tasmania, along with a collaboration from a number of different universities and partners, to bring ParkinsonNet to Tasmania and to Western Victoria. We're going to try and work out how it's going to be adapted to the Australian system here, and we're going to then implement it and evaluate it. And so I'm really excited that it has a real rural focus. So we'll be coming up here to the north and the northwest to really try and work with the community here to implement it. Just last two slides to tell you what else we've been doing in the Parkinson's space. Some of you may know that we've also developed a Parkinson's MOOC, so to follow on from the many MOOCs that we have at the University of Tasmania. And this was a collaboration with a neurologist, Professor Jane Alty in the south. And on our first 4 months, we reached 26,000 people in 160 countries, and it's ranked 5th in the world of health and medical MOOC. So it's been absolutely fantastic. We again interviewed many, many people with Parkinson's, researchers and clinicians from all over the world. And so it's an incredible resource to have. And finally, again, this is another big project that we've been rolling out since last year. It's another collaboration with Professor Jane Alty, the Tasmanian Parkinson's Project, and really has really built on the work of Dr. Harley Stanton, who I notice is in the audience, who has brought together researchers, clinicians and people with Parkinson's in Tasmania to really, I guess, increase the amount of work that's happening now in Parkinson's in Tasmania. So this project has two arms. It has an education arm for people with Parkinson's and the community, and the MOOC is part of that, but we also run regular webinars, and so you can sign up and come to the webinars. They're on all sorts of things from sleep, communication to mime for Parkinson's, so we try to cover everything. And then we have the research arm that has the projects like ParkinsonNet, but also we're looking at trying to work out who's at risk of Parkinson's so that we can intervene early, and also to really precisely track progression of Parkinson's over time and looking at different subtypes in preparation, hopefully, for when there are better interventions to slow the progression of the disease. So you can sign up again by going to a QR code or just Googling UTAS and Parkinson's. And so I would also like to just acknowledge the people that have funded my research who are listed there. And yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michelle. Our final speaker tonight is Dr. Rosie Clark. Rosie, like myself, is a neuroscientist, and she's going to tell you all about her work trying to understand the mechanisms of motor neuron disease and develop new treatments. So welcome, Rosie.
Always a good start. Apologies for my voice. I've got a bit of a croak going on. So I think the theme of today seems to be love your brain, and I couldn't agree more with that. I guess as one of the neuroscientists down in Menzies, the brain is very important and we need to take care of it as much as we can for multiple reasons, whether it's stroke, Parkinson's, dementia, or also motor neuron disease, which I'll be talking about today. So I just wanted to put this flower up here. This is actually the international MND flower, the blue corn flower. It's stunning, but it's also incredibly tough. So it really reflects the people, I think, who you meet who get motor neuron disease. They're usually the most wonderful people, but they're incredibly tough, as are their families, because it's one of the more difficult diseases, I think, that we have to face and that we are yet to develop effective treatments and cures for. So just a little bit about myself before I start on motor neuron disease. So I was actually from Launceston. I went to Launceston College. I've been at Riverside High School. That's where I started, developing, I guess, an interest in science. Do enjoy Lake St Clair, etc., National Park. And yeah, I guess I've moved all the way down across the border, the Bogues Cascade border, down to Hobart. I do still enjoy a good Bogues though, I'll say that. And yeah, I guess my goals have been focused around science, and that led me to neuroscience because it's, more and more, what are the things we don't understand? What is the most interesting and difficult problems we have at the moment? And I think motor neuron disease is possibly one of those problems that you may or may not have heard about, but I'm hoping you guys have heard about the ice bucket challenge that went around a couple of years ago, where every person was putting a bucket of water on their head in the middle of winter. That's me there in the front getting a bucket. It was already about 5 degrees outside, so it was a very good day to have an icy bucket of water put on your head. I think Tracy's also in there somewhere there, in the middle there, getting a bucket of water on her head. So good on that for our current director, having had the treatment to raise awareness for motor neuron disease research. So what is motor neuron disease? You may have also heard of Neil Danaher and his amazing work that he's been doing as the co-founder of Fight MND and the Big Freeze, if you follow the AFL. You may have seen the event they hold there where they've got a number of people shooting down slides and getting dunked in water and all sorts. And that has done an absolutely phenomenal job for people like me who are working on trying to figure out motor neuron disease. So the advocacy that he's created, obviously, and the benefit of the investment that he's created has given a lot of us early career researchers an opportunity to pursue trying to figure out what causes motor neuron disease, and adequately and rightly so was named Australian of the Year this year for his work in advocacy in support of motor neuron disease and people with motor neuron disease. So motor neuron disease is also known as amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, but I'm basically going to refer to it as motor neuron disease throughout the talk today. And I guess one of the most common people when we think about motor neuron disease might be Stephen Hawking. And he's an excellent example of motor neuron disease, except for the fact that he's lived about 50 years longer than we would have expected for anyone who has motor neuron disease. And there was also the famous story in America of Louis Gehrig. So it was one of the first few people, I guess, in the modern era where we're able to actually track motor neuron disease and see it happen to someone in such a public place over time, where they can actually look at his batting averages over time and watch as motor neuron disease basically stopped his ability to hit these amazing home runs. So in America, they actually call it Louis Gehrig's disease after, I guess, watching his career demise. So what is motor neuron disease? Well, it's the most common form of adult onset motor disease impairment. It's one of those progressive diseases that Michelle was referring to. And I guess as emphasized here by Stephen Hawking, it destroys the motor system and the ability to control your voluntary muscles. So Stephen Hawking there, it obviously spares the intellect and senses. So he's an incredibly smart, bright man, and he's effectively trapped within inside his own body. So he can still think just as well. There's nothing wrong with the brain for the most part. Sometimes you do get instances where there's an overlap with forms of dementia called frontal temporal dementia with motor neuron disease. But for the most part, people are effectively trapped within their own bodies. So the problem we have for motor neuron disease is that unlike stroke or Parkinson's, I guess, we've got a lot more clues about what's going on there. And at the moment for motor neuron disease, we don't really have any effective treatments. So for most people, the treatments we have can give people an extra 2 or 3 months at best. And the average expectancy for survival post-diagnosis, unfortunately, is around 2.5 years for people. So some people it's far less. So I had a friend up north whose cousin got diagnosed and, within the year, unfortunately, he passed away, and he was only 23. So it's incredibly brutal. So as a neurological disorder that affects the muscles and the motor system, the main cell type, I guess, in our body that controls muscles and our motor movement is the cell called a motor neuron. And that's really what defines this disease. So basically, as the motor neurons that are residing in your brain and in the spinal cord become dysfunctional, degenerate. They're no longer able to pass signals from the brain to the spinal cord and down to the muscle. And this leads to a muscle weakness and a progressive paralysis. And that paralysis will eventually lead to atrophy, and people will eventually pass away due to respiratory failure normally. So, as I mentioned, not sure if we can get the mouse. Oh, no, not really see on there. Maybe. Oh, nope, go back. There with. I'll point. So as you can see up here in this blue strip here, this is the section of the brain that we call the motor cortex. And that's the area where we have these cells in our brain called the upper motor neurons. And these cells are basically responsible for sending a signal from your brain down into your spinal cord, where we have another group of cells we call the lower spinal motor neurons. And they're actually these cells dark here that just sit inside your spinal cord. And then they basically propagate a signal down to your muscle. And that allows the muscle to contract and relax. And we get movement. So in motor neuron disease, those motor neurons that are important for sending that information down to muscle movement become dysfunctional and eventually degenerate, leading to the problems with voluntary muscle control that we see in motor neuron disease. So when we think about motor neuron disease, I guess from my point of view, as someone who's trying to figure out what's going on and how we can possibly develop new treatments to help, improve quality of life for people with motor neuron disease or slow down disease progression, I kind of think about motor neuron disease in two different baskets. There's people who have genetically inherited forms of motor neuron disease, and these people can, have a family history where their father or their grandfather has also had motor neuron disease. But that only accounts for about 10% of motor neuron disease. The other 90% of motor neuron disease just appears out of the blue. You're just walking down, and then suddenly you've got problems with lifting your leg. You may need to go see a neurologist because there's some other symptoms. Maybe your speech starts slurring because you have a bulbar form of onset of motor neuron disease. And it just appears out of the blue. So there's two roads for therapy here, because one, we have a genetic cause with known genes that we can look at. And the other form, we're still trying to figure out what's going on. What are the factors that cause motor neuron disease to appear? So for those people who have the genetically inherited form of disease, we can see here that there's so many different genes that can be involved in motor neuron disease. And this is one of the problems about why it's such a complicated puzzle to be working on, because all these genes have slightly different functions. But in these people, when they have copies of that gene that are not properly working or have something wrong with that gene, what they're responsible for doesn't work correctly and leads to those muscles and motor neurons to die. But importantly, I guess, with genetics, we're getting better at finding what these genes are, which is really, really helpful. So we're developing new techniques, which are kind of really, really, really cool, where we can actually develop small little peptides that can bind to those genetic codes in people who have these rare forms of genetic motor neuron disease and prevent the protein that leads to their form of disease from being produced in the first place. So this is very, very recent kind of advances in our technology to be able to kind of come up with these forms of, I guess, small molecules that can bind to some of these different genes that are in our system and prevent them from causing the damage or making more damage to what we're seeing. So recently, this is the best, I guess, really recently, as in the last 2 or 3 years. This is one of the drugs that is targeting one of those genes that's been created. It's called tofersen, and it's really, really cutting edge kind of treatment strategy. So this gentleman here in the wheelchair was wheelchair bound, was given the drug to be able to block his mutated form of this gene. and can walk again. Even, yes, he hasn't got the full ability because, you know, he's probably still lost a lot of his motor neurons. But what the treatment's done is prevented those motor neurons that are left from degenerating further and preventing the connections to the muscle being lost more than what has already been present in his system. And, you know, in the case where Michelle was talking about, then this brings in the opportunity for rehabilitation. So this is very cutting edge kind of, I guess, approach to trying to treat a disease is by knowing what genes are present in there and trying to block them and stop those proteins from being produced, which I thought was pretty flipping cool. What about those other 90% of people who have that sporadic form of MND, where we don't know what genes are involved? We have no clue. Their family history says, you shouldn't have motor neuron disease, but now you do. What do we do for them? And that's kind of where I live most of the time. So I'm a lab-based scientist. So a lot of the time I'm at a literal white coat laboratory desk trying to figure out what causes this sporadic form of MND. So when I was talking about, we think about motor neuron disease, the motor neurons define motor neuron disease, obviously because we get that loss of motor function and the muscle failure and paralysis. However, MND might not be caused by just the motor neurons alone. So actually in the brain, which I do love, we have a number of different cells present there that have a lot of supporting roles to make sure that this upper motor neuron here in green is able to function and do its job properly. So if you think about that person in green, I guess, if you will, being, let's say, I don't know, the guy collecting garbage off your street, something like that. He can't do his job if the truck isn't maintained. He can't do his job if the driver who's going to the right address doesn't know where he's going. All these guys around here are helping the motor neuron to do its job correctly. So if they're not helping to keep the motor neuron happy and healthy, then there's no hope in treating it. If we just try and treat the motor neuron by itself, but its whole neighborhood of cells is contributing to its demise, we need to kind of look at it in a different way and not just go, let's treat the motor neuron. Let's treat the other cells around it that also are required to keep that motor neuron functioning. So, as I mentioned, ALS is not just a result of genetic mutations alone. What we've learned basically, as you can see here on this pie chart, in color in the green there, that's how much of the disease is genetic. In gray here is roughly what we think of currently in terms of the percentage of disease. So it's approximately 80%. We've learned of some new genes at the moment, so about 80% of the disease being sporadic. So for some of those genes, we learn that they will contribute to disease. So they might, for instance, contribute to a couple of steps towards getting that disease. Or another type of gene might contribute more towards getting motor neuron disease. Another type of gene will give you even more risk of going down the pathway that will lead you to motor neuron disease. But what are the other things in there that, if you don't have these genes, lead you to develop motor neuron disease? That's what we've got to figure out for these people who have the sporadic form of the disease. So there's a number of different theories, and these are just some of the biological processes that we think are important inside, I guess, the disease causing processes that lead to motor neuron disease. So there's things that involve how your energy is produced inside the motor neurons, how your motor neurons buffer against the amount of debris and things that are produced as a byproduct of just aging and consuming energy. There's, thoughts that neuroinflammation inside the brain can also lead to the motor neurons not being able to survive or repair themselves. And there's also thoughts about maybe there's inability for the brain to handle certain proteins that are produced in the brain properly. So the thought is that instead of just targeting one of those pathways with one drug, we kind of need to move away from motor neuron disease being thought of as it's one disease, we treat it with one drug, that'll fix it. That's probably not the case for this kind of disease. What we need to work towards is something that's going to target possibly multiple of those factors that we know are important in the disease, whether it be the neuroinflammation, whether it be the other supporting cells. So if we think about it more like cancer, we don't just give someone one drug to treat cancer. We give them multiple drugs that are going to work together to tackle different parts of the problem. And I think that's kind of where motor neuron disease research is heading now. So it's been a bit, of time getting towards this point, but I think that's probably where we need to head for people with sporadic forms of motor neuron disease. So thankfully, I guess I've walked into research at a great time. So there's been a lot of advances in clinical imaging in particular. So there's been a lot of work looking at the brain for people with motor neuron disease, and a great group out of Sydney has done a lot of great work where they've literally been looking at people with motor neuron disease and having a look at what's different inside their brains. Some people with family histories, so they've gone in before they've got motor neuron disease, had a look at their brain, and then they've developed motor neuron disease, and they've still been able to look at their brain after by doing sort of clinical imaging to be able to see what's going on in terms of the brain activity inside that person's brain. So what basically they've found using these functional imaging studies is that months prior to the onset of symptoms in people, that I can actually see this spike of activity within the motor cortex with people with motor neuron disease. And that's just occurring just months before the first emergence of symptoms in people. So it's something that we think is really, really important. So what we've learned from that is that if they also measure, let's say, what's happening to the muscle at the same time, the muscle at that point in time still appears to be happy and healthy. They can't see anything wrong with it. They can't find out if there's any changes in activity there. So the change in the brain, in the motor cortex, seems to be one of the earliest things that we can see and detect. And there's this massive spike of activity that occurs. So what is this spike of activity? What does it do? And is it possibly causing the onset of motor neuron disease for these people? So importantly as well, they've shown that the level of activation of this is also associated with survival. So if you have a bigger activation, faster decline. So it's one of those symptoms that we think is really, really important for what's going on in the brain of people with motor neuron disease, but it might also hold important clues about how to stop or slow the disease. So like in life, in our brain, balance is important. I wouldn't want to be that guy. I guess he was good at what he did, but I would have that cup of tea right now. So in the brain, balance is important. And that's the same in terms of motor neuron function and muscle control. So you see this young gentleman here, he's got a lot happening in his motor cortex right now to be able to do that. And I don't think I'd be pulling that one off anytime soon. I'd probably be over there in the fan somewhere having fallen off. So in the brain, there's a number of different cells that are important for making this balance occur basically, and facilitate that activity to be balanced. So I remember I was saying in the functional imaging studies, they had this big spike of activity within the motor cortex with people with MND. So in the brain, these cells, these excitatory cells, basically release a neurotransmitter called glutamate. That leads to activity. That's our action potentials. That's how our neurons talk to each other. On the other hand, we have these inhibitory cells. So they're kind of what I think about as like the resistors in the circuit. They stop that activity from occurring. They allow temporal and spatial control. Without my interneurons, it would be go, 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 go. And then obviously your brain will be very, very active. So a lot of people have been looking at this excitatory side of the problem based on that evidence that we see this big spike in activity in the brain of people with motor neuron disease. But fewer people have been looking at the flip side of the coin, which is these inhibitory cells. Why are they not stopping the motor neurons from becoming hyperexcitable? Why are they not preventing them from burning themselves out effectively? So this is kind of what I deal with. You don't need to look at the detail too much there, but look at the number of colors there. So most people, even neuroscientists, think about inhibitory interneurons as a cell type. But in reality, there are many, many different types in our brain, and they all have slightly different roles. So it's a tricky puzzle to approach, but I think it's an important part of the puzzle because I think understanding how these resistors in our brain work will help us prevent those motor neurons from being burnt out. So basically a lot of my work has been trying to find these key cell players in the brain. Which types of these interneurons are involved in the disease? So you can see here, this is sort of what a brain looks like when you're looking down a microscope. You've got a number of different cells there, and we can use tools to basically make certain proteins on these cells light up, and we can actually see what these proteins look like, what these cells look like, how many of them are there, are they talking to who they should be talking to, have they forgotten to shake hands with the supporting cell next to them, what's going on with them. So what I've been focusing on at the moment is a particular type of interneuron called a neuropeptide Y expressing interneuron. You don't need to know that detail. Again, Tracy mentioned there won't be a test. But these guys are quite interesting from my point of view. So I don't know if you can see here, on the left here, that's a slice of the motor cortex in an actual human brain. So thankfully, people do donate their brains to science, and it's incredibly helpful and important for us so we can understand what's going on in the brain of people who develop these diseases and get us clues towards what's going on with the disease. So on the left here, I think you can see we've kind of got these nice processes here of this MPY interneuron. You've got some sparse pixelated red going on there. In the middle, okay, there's not really any of these cell somas present here. That's someone who has motor neuron disease, and that's 12 months. They've passed away after 12 months of disease. So that's a very, very rapid disease progression. And that's what their brain looks like with that MPY interneuron. This on the right here is someone who's lived 60 months with the disease. So that's a very long time for most people who have disease. That's a very slow form of disease in terms of what we consider motor neuron disease. But I hope you can see on the right and appreciate how bright the red is and what the cell types look like in terms of the illumination of that signal. So it seems to be there's something going on with this neuropeptide Y in the brain of people with motor neuron disease and in the motor cortex where we see that change in activity. So we have to, that's good. We look at pretty pictures, but we need to do enough pretty pictures to actually say, is there something going on here? So we do this in a number of cases of motor neuron disease and with controls. And then we've also got to look at different parts of the brain as well and go, oh, is this just something that occurs in the brain everywhere in motor neuron disease or only in regions that we associate with the development of the disease? So this graph is basically just telling you here on the left, in white, the motor cortex, that's the controls in white little circles there. Someone in the group of people with ALS in the black dots there in the motor cortex, you can see there's just higher, meaning a lot more of that MPY present in their brains. But in the sensory cortex, so that's, something that involved with smelling and seeing, things that aren't lost in motor neuron disease, we see no spike in that neuropeptide Y, the same level. So it seems to be something that's specifically occurring within the motor cortex of people with motor neuron disease. And we look at different forms of motor neuron disease. So people can present with an upper limb first. We'll call that upper limb onset, or they can present with a lower limb onset. So their leg might be affected first. We call that lower limb onset, or bulbar onset, where it affects speech and swallowing first. When I look at the cases, it doesn't matter. They've all got this increase of MPY in the brain. So it seems to be irrespective of what side of onset you get from motor neuron disease, you've got this peptide being raised in your brain. And it's the same in males and females, so it doesn't appear to be affected by sex or anything. So what we do at this point is we all hit the books and we read everything that's ever been written on this particular protein and peptide and try and figure out how is this related to motor neuron disease and what we know about the disease. And interestingly, this peptide is a bit unique in that it actually has been found to have roles in epilepsy and a few other diseases where you see this change in activity within the brain. And in fact, when I look at the overlap for processes that we know go wrong in motor neuron disease, this peptide seems to act on a number of those different processes. So it may be one of those peptides that can have a range of different effects in the brain to affect multiple things at once that are all important to supporting those motor neurons. So kind of thinking maybe that it has an important role in the disease. So what we do then is we go, okay, we've learnt that maybe this MPY is increased in the disease. What do we actually know about the people who had the disease when they passed away? So we actually look at how that MPY level associates with disease characteristics, such as when they were diagnosed, when they passed away, how long they had disease for. And what you can actually see here, I'm not sure if it's super clear, but basically I've split the group of ALS cases into those who had really high MPY, those that had high but not as high MPY. So the group on the left basically has the lower levels of MPY. The group on the right of people had higher MPY in the red there. And basically you can see here that people with the higher levels had a slower disease progression. So this kind of tells us that maybe it's associated with something to do with how the disease is progressing. So maybe if we manipulate this system, we can actually have an effect on changing the disease trajectory for people. That's kind of what we're thinking at the moment. And I won't go on too much more about what we're working on at the moment, but we haven't stopped there. We're now trying to basically figure out how to manipulate this system to figure out if we can change how the disease is progressing. Can we slow it down? Can we halt it? We've got some interesting clues that tell us the system is involved. So when we add in the peptide into a system and have a look at how it affects the motor neurons, we can see it will be involved in cell death. We can see it's going to change how those motor neurons are performing over time. But yeah, pending, come back maybe next year to see how we're going with that. And I'd just like to leave it, I guess, in saying that for any of these diseases, for stroke, for Parkinson's, it's advocacy and awareness that is just as important. So it's great for us to be locked away in a lab or not for you guys, you're out on the street speaking to people, but yeah, advocacy and awareness is so important because it allows us to kind of, communicate what we're trying to do, but also to, help raise awareness for those who have family members affected. I think it's quite important. But I guess moving forward, we need to develop a better understanding of what's the nitty-gritty going on behind these diseases to try to develop better treatments and cures. And I think that's heading towards these targeted precision therapies or polytherapies where we can use multiple treatments or really finely targeted treatments to target those genes that we know are involved. And I'd just like to thank everyone who was involved in this work, our research group, Trace, and the MND local groups, Fight MND, who was helped involve funding this work, the Australian Brain Bank Network for helping source the material that was required from the people who donated their brains for the disease to be studied, and Motor Neuron Disease Research Institute Australia for supporting me to get some of this work done. So thank you.
Thank you, Rosie. I'll now ask Shauna and Rosie and Michelle to come on up and we'll open it up for questions. If anybody has questions, there's a chair. Wow, it's a true panel. If anyone has any questions for any of our speakers tonight, for Shauna or Michelle or for Rosie. Yes. Oh, there's just one behind and then I'll come back to you. Oh, Jane's going to run. Okay. There's a gentleman here and then one in the front.
Rosie, this might be a naive question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Is there any sort of equivalent disease of the sensory neurons? We've got disease of motor neurons. Do we have anything of the sensory neurons equivalent? And if not, why not? And if we have, what can we learn from?
That's an excellent question. That is such a good question. I've never had that question. that is a really good question, and actually it's one of the things we're looking at. So we actually are looking at what are called the ocular motor neurons. They're their own little pool of motor neurons in the brain, and they're spared in motor neuron disease. So that's why people with motor neuron disease can use eye commands to still control computers or use them to move their chairs. So the eyes are actually spared in motor neuron disease. And we're actually kind of looking at what's different between those ocular motor neurons and what's different compared to those upper motor neurons in the motor cortex and the spinal cord? And what can that tell us about what's leading to the vulnerability of the motor neurons that are involved in MND? That is one of the key questions in the field right now. So you've absolutely nailed that. In terms of diseases that are involve degeneration of the eyes, I can't actually think any off the top of my head, although I think, there might be some childhood forms of degenerative conditions, but I think they're more neurodevelopmental disorders rather than neurodegenerative disorders. Trace?
I can't help but say something as well. I think what you've alluded to is kind of where the field is going. For a long time, we've focused on who is getting these diseases. And even in other neurodegenerative diseases, we know that there's a group of individuals who don't get neurodegenerative diseases or who age for a long time and show no cognitive impairment. So research looking at spared areas, areas of the brain that are right next door to the motor cortex, completely unaffected, is a real sort of, I guess, new frontier of thinking about these diseases rather than focusing on the cells that are lost, wondering and discovering more about the cells that are spared. So it's a really good question. Yeah, go for it. Oh, that's it. I'll keep this one and Jane will give you that one.
I think it's shorter, isn't it?
Yes.
What is the deprivation of sleep on cardiovascular?
Yeah, sleep's one of those new kind of risk factors that people in the field of cardiovascular health are interested in. And they're the American Heart Association that has developed a number of sort of indicators of ideal cardiovascular health have added sleep as one of their indicators for that. So it's certainly something that people are more aware of, and not getting enough sleep seems to be a risk factor, but also people that sleep too much, that may be an indicator of other things going on as well. I think at the moment we probably don't know the interventions probably to get people sleeping better and those types of things. So I think that's probably where the field's going, but it's one of those emerging risk factors for cardiovascular diseases and a range of other brain health related diseases as well.
Any other questions tonight?
One's for Shauna, and it's about stroke and AF screening as part of looking community-wide AF screening.
Yep.
I'm aware that Stroke New Zealand is starting a large program there in screening for AF. Also aware that Maria Health in New Zealand is doing the same. I'm interested in what's happening in Tasmania with regard to AF screening.
Yeah, that's a great question. And so AF is atrial fibrillation, which is where the heart is beating irregularly, and that can cause clots to form that can travel up into the brain and cause the blockage. And yes, so there are some screening programs, and I believe some people through pharmacy here as well did work on a screening program a few years ago. There's probably nothing widespread happening in Tasmania at the moment. There are advances in a number of tools, also using a smartphone, as I mentioned before. So things like, the Apple watches and other things can potentially detect atrial fibrillation. And there are, I'm not sure, the booths that St. Luke's have, the SISU booths, they also detect heart rate. Now, the thing with atrial fibrillation is it doesn't happen all the time. So it happens and then it doesn't happen. So you kind of have to be watching the person at the right time to pick it up. So some of these screening tools can see if people are having it. If it looks like a person might have it, then they put in longer term monitoring to try and pick it up. But at the moment, there's nothing happening kind of across the community, but there's lots of opportunities there.
I will give away that I distribute Cardio Mobile in New Zealand.
There we go.
Yeah. I'm interested as
Yeah, great.
health.
Yeah.
Don't just the product in Tasmania,
Oh.
but that issue of link between, the common finding in 1 in 4 strokes that people have AF.
Yeah, no, great. Well, certainly, get in touch with us. We're doing a lot of work out in the community in various programs, high blood pressure, cholesterol, and so on. So, yeah, we'd be really interested to hear about, the products that are available.
Thank you, Michelle and Mari. I'm wondering if you have any information on autophagy. I think that some of the neurotoxicity and some of the inflammation and some of the oxidative stress issues are really critical in relation to Parkinson's and probably MND as well. I wonder if you've had any thoughts about what might be done to actually reduce that over time and the experience that others have had and what's happening around the world.
Autophagy. Want me to do it? Yeah. So the list that Rosie showed, excitotoxicity, oxidative stress, autophagy, these mechanisms are conserved around many neurodegenerative diseases. So you will have read about them in Parkinson's. They've also been implicated in dementia and particular types of dementia. And what we know is that these aren't necessarily single causes of the disease, because we see disorders in how autophagy is like how junk is processed by a cell. And we know that in a lot of these neurodegenerative diseases, proteins build up inside cells, and that's a common hallmark across them. But we know that we can't just target autophagy and that will solve these neurodegenerative diseases. And like Rosie said, we don't really know if it's the cause or if it's just a downstream effect, and we might need to go after autophagy on top of other parts of the pathway as well. But autophagy was very hot for a while in neurodegenerative diseases, and it's been looked at across many of them.
One other part of that, you mentioned oxidative stress being that's another of the byproducts of cells of aging. So we produce these reactive oxygen species. You know, the only way not to be doing that is not to be breathing. Don't recommend that. But or aging. So, you know, if you want to Benjamin button it up, go ahead. But we do actually have one of the new motor neuron disease treatments they were trialing in Japan was actually against this oxidative stress, edaravone, radiklava. So they've had some work. So they are pushing in the field to kind of come up against these treatments that are going to target some of these disease mechanisms we know they're important. And they have shown some benefit. But again, I think that's just going to be a small benefit until we start targeting, like in cancer, those important factors together in concert, will we actually have a meaningful effect on slowing down disease trajectory.
Yes. Okay. We've heard about risk factors for stroke, and we know that we don't know what risk factors there are for MND. But are there any risk factors for Parkinson's?
I mean, the biggest one is age. That's, you know,
Yeah,
apart from that one. There are a small number of people that will have genetic risk factors, although it's probably, you know, around 10% of people. I think the other thing that we probably don't know enough about, but it's pointing towards things like pesticides are potentially a risk factor. We know that there are, Harley wants to speak. I can see. No. Yeah. Yeah.
Another man tonight somewhere exposed to some of those things. 10 years' time, we'll be doing 20 times more in prevention on Parkinson's.
Thanks, Harley. Harley is a very big proponent of this and could speak a lot better than I could. But yes, absolutely, there are certain pockets in different parts of Australia that we know that there's farming and pesticides, and there seems to be a higher incidence there of Parkinson's. So I think it's an area that we need to look a lot more into.
One more about that. Or any other methods of drug solve body No, I haven't seen anything that's like been a side effect of another treatment. And I think what we're hearing about is people are realizing that risk for disease is complex, and these you might have an environmental exposure, or you might have an increased family risk, or you might have another thing going in your body and age as a risk factor. And together those things create our individual risk profiles. And we know that some people who may have had the identical environmental exposure that Harley has described, or other people in this room, they don't get Parkinson's. But what is unique for the individual is that risk on top of the other risks that they have, their sort of unique risk is what then causes this disease. So it's not a single cause, but a range of contributors.
A little bit of research out there that's also shown that potentially like stressful events can bring conditions on earlier. You may have already been going to get it, but a stressful event might bring it on earlier. Potentially, yeah, you know, that could be seen obviously as a stressful event. Yeah.
Well, I think, oh, sorry, Frank, go for it.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a similar question about motor neurone disease. I've heard that some people think it is increasing, and what do we know, if anything, about the potential environmental cause?
That's a great question. So, as I mentioned, obviously we know some genes are important, but we're learning more and more about what we call these environmental risk factors. So, like Parkinson's with pesticides, I concur. There should be some very interesting research going on about that. Very much so now, right now. There should be. If they're not, there should be more. But for MND, we've actually learnt some of the environmental factors similar to other neurodegenerative diseases. So age is a common factor. We know as we age, more likely to get neurodegenerative diseases. But things like blue-green algae. So when you have those blue-green algae blooms in fresh water, people are thinking there's certain cytotoxins that are released. So there's some case studies, I guess, where they've found hotspots of motor neuron disease. I think it was one in New South Wales recently, and the only thing they could trace back to be common to the cases was that they'd all visited this similar lake area that had this blue-green algae outbreak. So it may not be, you know, for everyone how their disease develops. And I think for motor neuron disease in particular, I think there's probably many, many different ways that you end up with motor neuron disease. It's just how the system becomes vulnerable. So what I didn't talk about on that slide is there were 6 steps. And mathematically, that's what we consider there's 6 steps towards developing motor neuron disease. So for cancer, we think there's 2 steps, something that causes the tumor genes to switch on, something that stops us from seeing them. In motor neuron disease, we think there's 6 steps. But if you think about those 6 steps, a number of different ways that 6 steps could occur for one of those steps, you know, 20 different pathways could be affected, pesticides, algae blooms to cause one of those steps to become active. So that's why it's a really, really tricky problem to look at those environmental risk factors. But there's some great work going down at the moment at UTAS, down in the medical precinct, looking at these risk factors and seeing what we can do when looking at these different chemicals and see how they affect motor neurons to get more evidence to say, hey, look, we need to screen for that. And if it's in the water of the population, then that something needs to be done about that. But yeah, there's definitely some interesting things going on.
One up the back, and then we might make that the last question.
Hello, can you tell me, is it true that with MND that a lot of people that develop it are leaner, they have a lower body mass index? And if that is true, whether you know why that is true?
I can't tell you without looking up the references myself emphatically if that's true or not. But I can say we do have this theory called the Ferrari hypothesis. So one of the other risk factors that we look at for motor neuron disease happens to be a lot of soccer players develop motor neuron disease. A lot of people maybe who are heading the ball or something. So we're wondering if there's something to do with one of those critical hits that leads to motor neuron development involving some sort of trauma to the brain. So people are looking at that as well. I don't know if you want to add on that, Trace.
Yeah. I guess for people who don't know, I also work on motor neuron disease, so I'm not just illegitimately taking the microphone. This idea of athletes being predisposed to motor neuron disease has been looked at for a range of different reasons, and as Rosie said, one of the the ideas is a head trauma associated with professional soccer players. Other people have wondered whether or not it's athletes who have conditioned their muscles and they're very, I guess, have by playing professional sport, have used their muscles at a much higher rate than perhaps, you know, the normal population. And does that play into risk as well? Because what we do know about people with MND is they're often they're disproportionately physically fit. So they're very well. And so that's maybe, you know, as you're talking about lean. So it's not a disease where we see obesity or those other physical attributes playing into risk, because often people with MND are incredibly well, incredibly healthy, and disproportionately we see athletes. Now, sometimes that's because we just see athletes and they're more known and they have a greater visibility in our community. So we can't let ourselves stray too far into thinking those things go together. But that is very well known, this idea of the typical type of person who gets MND.
I think about it like cars. You've got like your Volvo and your Ferrari, right? So like athletes, your Ferraris, they're so finely tuned system that if one thing goes wrong, that car's going to break instantly. But you know, your Volvo, oh, it's leaking for a little bit for a while, but it still keeps going on because the system can handle it. So I mean, that's kind of the Ferrari thought about people who have motor neuron disease maybe being so highly tuned that their system just breaks much, much easier or is more vulnerable possibly than other people. But that's my 2 cents on that one.
So thank you, everyone. The good news is everyone coming along tonight, you've done something wonderful for your own brains, just coming out, being together, listening to some new information, hearing about the work that we do at Menzies. You've already done something wonderful for your own health. So thank you for coming out. We appreciate it. So I really just want to finish tonight by thanking Paris and Jane from our advancement team for helping us come to Launceston and run this event. We'll be back again. And I really just wanted to particularly thank those people in the audience who are donors to Menzies. We can't do the work that we do without your support. We truly appreciate it. And if you'd like to be involved in our studies or learn more about the work that we do, we have the QR code here. You're all getting good at QR codes now. Or we have a little flyer that you can take with you. But I really just did want to say thank you for coming out tonight to learn more about our work. We really appreciate your support. Thank you.